Welcome back to the deep end. We are back with another stack of research, another pot of coffee, and another topic that completely flipped my worldview upside down.
It is good to be here.
Yeah.
And yeah, flipped upside down is probably the right way to put it. We usually come in here with a topic that feels, I don't know, contained,
Yeah.
a specific tech trend or a historical event. Today is very different.
Today is wildly different because when I first saw the title of the source material we are diving into today, I will be honest, I rolled my eyes a little bit.
I saw your face when you read it.
I saw the letters LCHF, so low carb, high fat, and I immediately thought, okay, here we go. We are talking about keto. We are talking about fitting into skinny jeans or, skipping the breadbasket at dinner. I really thought we were doing a diet segment. And honestly, I almost put it in the maybe later pile.
I do not blame you at all. That is the standard cultural context for this entire conversation. When we see those four letters, we instantly think of vanity. We think of gym selfies or people on the internet arguing about whether a banana is allowed. It feels like a very personal lifestyle choice, and usually one that is purely for aesthetics.
Exactly. I was totally ready for a 10 tips to shred for summer kind of outline, but then I actually sat down and read the documents you brought in.
Yeah.
And I realized I was completely wrong. This is not a health segment. This isn't a beauty segment. This is how would you describe it?
It is a macroeconomic manifesto. It is a sociological restructuring plan disguised as dietary advice.
A macroeconomic manifesto based on what we eat. That is the hook for today, everyone. We are looking at a source that argues that shifting a nation's diet to low-carb, high-fat is not about personal weight loss. It is actually a national survival strategy.
It sounds incredibly hyperbolic, doesn't it? National survival. Yeah. But when you look at the data provided in this analysis, the logic is actually incredibly linear. The source material is looking at the global crisis of shrinking populations, aging societies, exploding healthcare costs. And it posits that the root cause, and therefore the only real solution, is metabolic.
It's wild. The premise is basically this. We are running out of workers. We are running out of money to care for the elderly. And the only way to fix it is to change human biology on a national scale.
Precisely. The mission of this deep dive is to unpack that exact argument. We are going to look at how this document claims we can extend the health span, and that is an important distinction from lifespan to 120 years.
120 years. That number stopped me in my tracks when I read it. I mean, we hear about blue zones and centenarians, but 120 as a standard baseline, that sounds like science fiction.
It is a very bold number. But the argument is that if you hit that number or even get close to it, you turn an aging population from a massive financial burden into the greatest economic asset a country has ever had. So today we are going to talk about saving the healthcare system from bankruptcy, completely rewriting the definition of retirement, and even how this metabolic shift changes the environment.
And the 24-hour productivity concept, which is, frankly, a little terrifying, but also fascinating. So, to our listener, buckle up. Put down the bagel, or maybe don't, we will get to that a bit, and let's dive into the macroeconomics of LCHF.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's start with the problem statement. Because any good policy paper starts with the world is on fire, and here's exactly why. The source paints a pretty grim picture of the current demographic situation.
It really does. And it is a picture that many developed nations are becoming intimately familiar with. You have demographic cliff. Birth rates are plummeting everywhere. The population is getting older fast. In the standard economic model that we use today, this is an absolute disaster.
Right, because we define the working age population as, 15 to 64?
Correct.
Yeah.
That is the standard OECD definition, 15 to 64. If you are in that bracket, you are a producer. You are making widgets, writing code, paying taxes. If you are 65 or older, statistically speaking, the model views you as a dependent.
Liability on the spreadsheet.
Exactly. You are consuming resources like pensions, healthcare, social support, without contributing to the GDP.
So if you have fewer babies being born and everyone is living longer, the math just breaks down. You end up with a tiny group of young people trying to pay for a massive group of old people. It is an inverted pyramid.
It is an inverted pyramid, and it eventually collapses under its own weight. Now, usually governments try to fix this by encouraging people to have more kids, which rarely works because raising kids is expensive and it's a huge cultural shift, or they try increasing immigration. But this source takes a completely different angle. It essentially asks, why is 64 the absolute cutoff?
Because that is when people get tired. I mean, that is when people retire. That's when society has decided you are done.
That is when people historically started to decline physically and cognitively. But the source argues that this decline is not inevitable aging. It argues that the decline is actually caused by metabolic disease.
Okay, so this is where the LCHF stuff comes in. The argument is that we aren't stopping work at 65 because of some natural law of the universe. We are stopping because we have fundamentally broken the machine.
Right. The document states that the modern diet, which is extremely high in refined carbohydrates, leads directly to metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. These are the things that, to quote the text directly, eat away at vitality.
Eat away at vitality. That is such a visceral image. So the argument is we are not stopping work at 65 because we are old. We are stopping because we are sick.
Precisely. We are metabolically compromised. So the proposal is simple. If you switch the national diet to LCHF, you prevent the insulin resistance. You prevent the metabolic syndrome entirely. And suddenly, a 70-year-old, an 80-year-old, even a centenarian retains the physical and cognitive function of a much younger person.
And that naturally leads to this 120-year health span concept. Let's actually unpack that word, health span, because I think a lot of people just confuse it with lifespan.
It is a crucial distinction to make. Lifespan is just how long you are alive. Is the heart beating? Is there brain activity? You could easily spend the last 20 years of your lifespan in a hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, completely unable to feed yourself. That is lifespan without health span.
Which is, frankly, my personal nightmare.
It is everyone's nightmare. And unfortunately, it is the reality for a huge portion of the population right now. Health span, on the other hand, is the period of life spent in good health, fully functional, and independent. The source strongly implies that biological limits are much higher than we currently think, provided we aren't constantly praising the engine with the wrong fuel.
Okay, let me play the skeptic for a second.
Mhm.
120 years. Is there actual science in the source to back this up, or is this just wishful thinking? Because that is literally doubling the current active life of many people.
The source bases this on the Hayflick limit of cell division and the potential of mitochondrial function. The argument isn't that we are inventing immortality. It is that the human body is actually designed to last that long, but metabolic friction wears it down prematurely.
Metabolic friction. I like that term. It sounds like sand in the gears of a car.
That is exactly what high blood sugar and insulin resistance are. Sand in the gears. They cause systemic inflammation, they damage blood vessels, they severely degrade mitochondrial function. The source argues that if you simply remove the sand by switching to LCHF, the machine just keeps running.
Okay, so let's play this out economically. If this source is right, and we can actually keep people healthy, active, and sharp until they are 120, what does that actually do to the workforce?
It causes an absolute explosion of labor availability. Think about the math here. If the working age is 15 to 64, that is roughly a 50-year window of productivity. If the working age becomes 15 to 100,
You have just practically doubled the workforce.
you have doubled or even tripled the available productive population. The source calls this a qualitative and quantitative expansion of human resources. Suddenly, the labor shortage caused by low birth rates just vanishes. You don't need to import workers. You just stop discarding the ones you already have.
That is mind-blowing to think about. But I have to ask, and I know you listening right now are probably thinking this too, do we actually want to work until we are 100? I mean, isn't retirement the whole goal? The golden years, sitting on a beach somewhere doing nothing.
That is the massive cultural hurdle, right? We are deeply conditioned to see work as toil and retirement as freedom. But the source frames it very differently. It is not about forcing people to work against their will. It is about capability. Currently, people are forced to stop because their bodies or minds literally give out, or the corporate system pushes them out because they are viewed as expensive liabilities.
Right. But if I felt as good at 90 as I do at 40, honestly, I would probably get so bored sitting on a beach after about 3 weeks.
Exactly. Humans inherently need purpose. We need to feel needed. The source argues that retirement as a total cessation of work is actually terrible for human health. It radically accelerates cognitive and physical decline. It is the classic use it or lose it principle.
So the LCHF strategy supports the biology to keep working, and then the work supports the biology to keep the brain sharp. It is this perfect positive feedback loop.
It is. And that leads us perfectly into the next segment of the source material. Because the document is very specific about what kind of work these super seniors would actually be doing. It is not about manual labor volume. It is not about making 90-year-olds dig ditches or stack boxes. It is about wisdom.
Yes, this was the part of the notes where I wrote down in giant letters, the brain drain. Let's talk about the crisis of lost knowledge.
This is a silent tragedy we see in almost every complex industry today. You have someone who has worked in a field for 40 years. They've seen every crisis. They know every loophole. They have incredibly deep institutional memory. And then they hit 65 and they just leave.
Poof, gone. All that knowledge walks out the door.
And they are usually replaced by a 25-year-old who is incredibly smart and energetic, but has absolutely zero historical context. The source specifically points out complex fields where this is devastating. It mentions large-scale plant construction, nuclear energy, renewable energy projects like hydro, solar, and wind.
Nuclear energy is a great example. You really do not want a rookie running the show there, do you? You want the guy who knows exactly what that weird humming sound means because he heard it once during a crisis in 1985.
Exactly. Crisis management, overseas business development, complex civil engineering. These fields heavily require what sociologists call crystallized intelligence.
Crystallized intelligence. Break that down for us. How is that different from regular smarts?
Well, fluid intelligence is your raw processing speed. How fast can you solve a brand new puzzle? That typically peaks in your 20s. That is exactly why you see young people dominating in fast-paced coding environments or disruptive startups. But crystallized intelligence is the ability to use learned knowledge and deep experience. It is wisdom. It is pattern recognition. And that keeps growing and compounding as you age unless disease interferes.
So the source is saying that under our current system, we are literally throwing away this crystallized intelligence just as it is getting most valuable simply because the container, the physical body, is breaking down.
Right. It calls it a painful loss for the nation. But under the LCHF paradigm, if that veteran engineer keeps their cognitive clarity and physical stamina, they don't retire. They transition into an even higher value role.
The document uses the term productive aging versus dependent aging. I really like that distinction. It feels incredibly important.
It is a complete paradigm shift. Dependent aging is the current model we live in. Seniors are welfare recipients. They are objects of care. This creates a massive psychological burden on them and a crippling financial burden on the young generation. Productive aging means seniors are active economic participants. They are value creators.
Just imagine a 90-year-old who has 60 years of continuous field experience.
That is an asset that a 25-year-old literally cannot replace. No amount of enthusiasm or late nights replaces 60 years of actual data points. If you can keep that brain online, the economic value to a company and a country is incalculable.
And socially, that changes everything too. Right now, there's the subtle and sometimes not so subtle tension between generations, the okay boomer stuff.
It is the burden narrative. You hear young people say, I cannot buy a house or start a family because my taxes are so insanely high to pay for the pension system. The young feel totally squeezed. But if you flip that narrative, and the 90-year-old is still generating wealth, still paying taxes, still mentoring, the intergenerational conflict just evaporates. It becomes integration.
Imagine a mentorship model where the 25-year-old brings the new tech savvy, the AI skills, the rapid coding, and the 85-year-old brings the strategic wisdom and the deep industry context.
That is exactly the intergenerational integration the source is talking about. Instead of conflict and resentment, you get collaboration. But again, this only works if the 85-year-old is sharp. If the 85-year-old is struggling with cognitive decline or low energy, that partnership just doesn't work. The biology is the absolute prerequisite for the sociology.
It always comes back to the biology. You cannot have the super senior without the ketones.
Oh, according to this analysis, yes. The diet is the enabling technology for the social change.
It is fascinating to think of a diet as a technology. We usually think of tech as silicon and code and microchips. But food is literally the software that runs the hardware of the human body.
And if you upgrade the software, the hardware can do things you didn't think were remotely possible, like working productively in a high-stress engineering field at 100 years old.
It is a beautiful vision, but, and there is always a but, it relies heavily on the medical side of this holding up. Because getting people to work longer is great, but avoiding the astronomical cost of them getting sick is the real game changer here.
It is. Which brings us to the money, the cold, hard cash of it all. Segment 3 of the outline, the economics of disease. Because this source is not just saying people will feel better, It is saying this metabolic shift will literally save the national budget.
Let's follow the money then, because the source claims that the current healthcare model is basically a suicide pact for the national treasury.
It identifies the single biggest leak in the national treasury of any developed nation.
Yeah.
Chronic disease management.
I was reading through the source's breakdown of this, and it points the finger at one specific thing. It doesn't say bad luck or genetics, it says insulin resistance.
It isolates insulin resistance as the root cause. This is the core mechanism, and we really need to understand this to grasp the economics.
Yeah, let's go deep on insulin resistance. We hear this term thrown around a lot in health circles. What is actually happening in the body, and why is it so incredibly expensive for the government?
Think of your cells like a house. Glucose, which is sugar from carbs, is a delivery of coal for the furnace to keep the house warm. Insulin is the delivery guy knocking on the door. In a healthy, metabolically flexible body, the door opens, the coal goes in, the house gets warm, everything works.
Simple enough, efficient.
But in the standard modern diet, we are pounding on that door 20 times a day with massive deliveries of coal. Breakfast, a mid-morning snack, lunch, an afternoon snack, dinner, dessert. Eventually, the cell says, I cannot take any more coal. The house is completely full. And it locks the door. It stops answering the knock. That is insulin resistance.
So the delivery guy, insulin, is just standing outside on the porch with all this coal, the sugar, and he's banging on the door, but nobody is answering.
And since the coal cannot stay in the street, which in this analogy is your bloodstream, the body has to shove it somewhere else quickly because high blood sugar is toxic. So it shoves it into fat cells. It shoves it into the liver, causing fatty liver disease. It rots the blood vessels. This toxic overflow is exactly what causes type 2 diabetes, massive obesity, heart disease, and Alzheimer's, which a lot of researchers are now explicitly calling type 3 diabetes.
So this one mechanism, the locked door, is the first domino that knocks down the whole line of impossibly expensive chronic diseases.
Precisely. And remember, these are expensive diseases. They are not acute. You don't just catch diabetes, go to the hospital, and get cured in a week. You manage it for decades. It is a subscription model of illness. You're paying for medications, constant checkups, severe complications, amputations, bypass surgeries for 30 or 40 years.
So the economic argument is stop delivering the coal. Switch to LCHF.
If you switch the population to LCHF, you stop the overflow. The cells finally get a chance to use the stored coal. They heal. The insulin sensitivity returns. The diseases either don't happen in the first place or they actually go into full remission. And suddenly the disease management cost for the state just plummets.
So the National Health Insurance Fund, which is currently screaming towards total bankruptcy in so many countries, suddenly goes from a massive deficit to a surplus.
It becomes incredibly robust. You have significantly fewer hospital visits, a massive reduction in high-cost treatments like lifelong dialysis or complex bypass surgeries. The source explicitly uses the phrase health insurance salvation.
That sounds almost religious. Salvation.
In macroeconomic terms, it kind of is. But
Right.
there is a hidden economic layer here that I found really fascinating when reviewing the material. It is not just the direct medical costs of the hospitals and drugs. It is the hidden cost of caregiving.
The source describes eliminating the time spent lying in a sickbed.
Think about the current reality for millions of families. If an aging parent gets dementia or has a severe stroke, often a family member, and statistically this is usually a daughter or daughter-in-law, has to quit their job entirely or severely reduce their hours to care for them.
This is the opportunity cost they mentioned.
Exactly. The economy effectively loses two workers in that scenario. It loses the parent to the chronic disease, and it loses the adult child from the active workforce so they can become an unpaid home nurse.
That is a devastating double whammy. The macroeconomy loses the productivity and tax revenue of the caregiver, and the specific family loses that crucial income, pushing them closer to poverty.
The source argues that if you completely eliminate that period of bedridden dependency, if you square the curve of life so people stay highly functional until the very end, you get a double economic benefit. The senior stays active and independent, and the adult child stays fully engaged in the workforce.
And then the absolute cherry on top of this whole financial argument, what does the government actually do with all that saved money?
Massive reinvestment. Instead of pouring billions upon billions into just keeping sick people alive but miserable, which is what we call the maintenance economy, you reinvest those billions into the future. You build better cities, you fund space exploration, you dramatically improve education infrastructure. It completely changes the upward trajectory of the entire nation.
It really does reframe what you eat from a personal diet to a matter of strict fiscal policy. It is amazing. But let's zoom in a bit here. We have been talking a lot about the nation, the federal budget, the broad workforce. Let's talk about the individual. Let's talk about you and me and our average Tuesday.
The micro-level revolution.
Because the source has this entire section on 24-hour productivity that honestly made me feel a little guilty about my lunch habits.
The lunch habits are absolutely central
Yes.
to this.
Yeah.
The source essentially says, you are wasting an unbelievable amount of your time eating.
Okay, that sounds a bit robotic. Human, stop fueling immediately. But what is the actual logic there?
It totally challenges the 3 meals a day plus snacks dogma. We are all raised to believe that breakfast is the most important meal of the day, that we constantly need to keep our metabolic fire burning by grazing on snacks all day long. The source argues that it's purely marketing from food companies, not human biology.
It creates a constant dependency on glucose. It keeps us trapped on the roller coaster.
Right. So on a high-fat diet, satiety lasts much, much longer. Fat chemically signals the brain, I am done, we have enough energy. Carbohydrates, especially refined ones, often signal the brain, more please, keep eating. So the daily model naturally shifts to eating just 1 or 2 meals a day.
Okay, sort of an intermittent fasting style.
Right. And the time calculation they provide is so simple but striking. If you aren't shopping for, prepping, cooking, eating, and cleaning up 3 times a day, plus dealing with multiple snacks, the source claims you easily save 2 to 3 hours daily.
2 to 3 hours every single day. That is a lot of time. That is essentially a part-time job. That is 14 to 21 hours a week just handed back to you.
It is huge. And the source asks a critical question. What do you do with that reclaimed time? It argues this dramatically improves quality of life. You use that time for self-development. You learn a new language. You spend actual uninterrupted time with your kids. You rest properly.
I really love the idea of reclaimed time. We are always complaining that we are just too busy. Maybe we are just too busy chewing.
We very well might be.
Yeah.
But there's a biological layer to this daily productivity too.
Yeah.
It is not just about having the extra hours on the clock. It is about the fundamental quality of your brain during those hours.
The no-crash brain.
Yes, we've all been there. It is 2 p.m. You had a big sandwich or a massive pasta bowl for lunch. What happens next?
The food coma. The absolute fog. I'm just staring at my screen, physically moving the mouse, but absolutely nothing is happening in my head. I am just actively waiting for the clock to move so I can go home.
That is the glucose roller coaster in action. Your blood sugar spikes from the pasta, massive amounts of insulin rush in to clear it out, and then your blood sugar crashes hard. Your brain literally panics because it thinks it is running out of its primary fuel. That is the famous sugar crash. And it absolutely kills workplace productivity.
And the source says LCHF fixes this entirely because of ketones.
Ketones. When you are fat adapted, your body produces ketone bodies from stored or dietary fat. The source describes this as a vastly superior fuel for the human brain. It provides a highly stable, steady burn. No wild spikes, no devastating crashes. It is like putting a large, dense log on a slow fire, rather than constantly throwing sheets of newspaper on it.
The text specifically uses the phrase clear mental status.
And high concentration all day. Just imagine if you didn't have those 2 to 3 hours of severe brain fog every single afternoon. Your creative and analytical productivity would skyrocket.
It is the difference between driving a car that needs gas every 100 miles and stops running immediately if you don't fill it, versus operating a nuclear submarine that just keeps humming along in the deep for months.
That is a perfect analogy. And for a modern economy that heavily relies on knowledge work, coding, writing, complex strategy, that mental stability is actually worth far more than physical muscular strength.
And it affects mood, too. The source touches on this briefly, but it is important.
Hangry is a very real physiological state. Hunger, combined with anger, is the literal stress response caused by plummeting blood sugar. Your body is pumping out cortisol. If your blood sugar is flat and stable because you are running on fat, your mood is highly stable. You are simply a better coworker. You are a much more patient parent.
So we are smarter, we have way more free time, we aren't crashing at our desks, and we are generally nicer people to be around. It sounds like the limitless pill, but it is just butter.
High-quality fats, yes. But it goes so far beyond just the individual feeling good. There is a whole section here on the macro ripple effect, how this metabolic shift changes global industry and the physical environment.
This part was deeply surprising to me. Usually when we talk about saving the planet or environmentalism, the narrative is very clear. Stop eating meat. Go entirely plant-based. Cows are destroying the climate.
Right. That is absolutely the dominant cultural narrative right now. But this source completely flips that on its head. It argues that a global shift to LCHF, which obviously implies eating more animal products and high-quality fats, is actually incredibly good for the environment.
How does that logic actually hold up under scrutiny? Because cows produce methane. We know this is a scientific fact.
It relies heavily on the concept of overall efficiency and value-added systems. Currently, our global food system is built entirely on volume and cheap calories. Monocropping. Millions upon millions of acres of corn, soy, and wheat. This completely depletes the topsoil and requires massive, unsustainable amounts of fossil fuel for synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and global transport.
And we just turn all that cheap, heavily subsidized grain into highly processed junk food.
Exactly. The source argues that as the population shifts to LCHF, the global demand for those cheap, destructive carbs collapses. Instead, consumer demand rapidly rises for high-quality fats and proteins, natural pasture-raised livestock, organic above-ground vegetables, healthy pressed oils.
So we actively move from a system of mass production of cheap nutritional fillers to a high-value added agricultural model.
Exactly. The entire agricultural sector transforms. It is no longer about growing the absolute maximum bushels of corn just to make high-fructose corn syrup. It is about raising the healthiest possible animals and plants. And properly managed pasture-raised animals can actually be part of a regenerative cycle that restores soil health and sequesters carbon.
And the environmental bonus also comes from a massive reduction in waste.
Yes, this is the core logic. If you're eating highly nutrient-dense food, say a quality steak or a rich omelet, you generally do not throw it away. It is expensive and it is incredibly filling.
Unlike the giant plastic bag of spinach that inevitably turns to green sludge in the bottom drawer of my fridge, or the half-eaten loaf of bread that goes moldy.
Or the literal mountains of packaging associated with modern snack foods. Think of the entire vending machine and convenience store economy. Every 200 calories of processed carbs comes wrapped in single-use plastic and foil. If people simply stop snacking all day, that entire massive waste stream practically disappears overnight.
So significantly less garbage in landfills, less food rotting and producing methane in the trash.
The source claims the absolute volume of municipal food waste drops dramatically. And since industrial food production, packaging, and waste disposal are huge, often ignored drivers of global carbon emissions, this natural reduction leads to a significantly lower overall carbon footprint for the nation.
It is a total butterfly effect. You decide to skip breakfast and eat a grass-fed steak for dinner, and somehow the sky above the city gets cleaner.
In a highly complex global system, everything is deeply connected. If you change the primary input, which is the national diet, you fundamentally change the macro output, which is the environment and the economy. It directly challenges the idea that plant-based is the only viable path to sustainability. It argues that human metabolic efficiency is actually the true path.
It is a deeply fascinating, comprehensive vision of the future. I want to circle back to where we started this whole conversation, the intro, that phrase, national survival strategy.
Yes.
We have covered the expanding workforce, stopping the brain drain of our elders, saving the federal budget, optimizing our daily lives, and even cleaning up the environment. When you stack all of those up together, the source's initial hyperbole really doesn't feel so hyperbolic anymore.
It goes from sounding like a crazy diet pitch to a highly coherent, necessary policy proposal.
It really does. It is essentially treating the human population like a highly valuable physical asset that desperately needs to be maintained properly.
That is the exact key. Currently, our economic system mostly treats the population like a captive consumer base. We feed them the absolute cheapest, most addictive food possible just so they buy more things and medical treatments. This source argues we should treat the population like a fleet of high-performance engines. You simply do not put cheap sugar in a Ferrari's gas tank.
And if you do put sugar in, the Ferrari inevitably breaks down at 60,000 miles.
Exactly. And the resulting mechanic bills completely bankrupt the owner. This source is saying, put the premium fuel in from day one. The Ferrari will run flawlessly for 120,000 miles. It will win more races. It will hold its inherent value.
And for a nation that is rapidly aging, which basically means the overall fleet of Ferraris is getting much older every year, keeping them running smoothly is literally the only way to stay in the global economic race.
It recovers vital national competitiveness. It completely stops the brain drain of our smartest workers. It actively solves the looming fiscal crisis of healthcare.
So what does this actually mean for you, the listener? Because most of our listeners are not prime ministers or global emperors, at least that we know of.
Probably not. Though if you are, take notes.
But seriously, this frames everyone's personal daily choices in a completely new light.
It profoundly does. Usually we tend to think of health and self-care as slightly selfish, like, I am doing this for me so I look good. But this source forcefully argues that taking rigorous care of your metabolic health is actually a vital civic contribution.
By simply staying healthy, you are literally saving the system money. You are staying productive. You are ensuring that you stick around long enough to pass on your accumulated wisdom.
You are intentionally removing yourself from the societal burden column and firmly placing yourself in the economic asset column.
That is a really powerful way to look at it. It adds a little bit of genuine nobility to just saying no to the office donut. You're not just watching your waistline. You are actively saving the GDP.
Every single little bit counts at scale.
I really want to end with a thought experiment, heavily based on that productive aging concept we discussed earlier. And I want you, the listener, to really think about this deeply.
Go for it.
We all grew up thinking the timeline of life is basically set in stone. You learn until you are 20, you work hard until you are 60 or 65, and then you rest until the end. That is the universal script we are handed.
That is the script, yes.
But if this source material is right, that script is completely broken and obsolete. So here's the question for you. If you knew, for an absolute biological fact, that you had to work until you were 100 years old, but you also knew you would feel amazing, totally sharp, and energetic doing it, how would you radically change your career plan today?
That is a very heavy existential question.
Listener, seriously, if you are driving, pull over for a second or pause doing the dishes. Imagine you are 35 right now. You probably think you are halfway to retirement. Now imagine the finish line suddenly moves. You are not retiring at 65. You are going to be working until you are 100.
Does that specific thought fill you with absolute dread? Or does it liberate you?
If the thought of doing your current job for another 60 years fills you with dread, maybe you are in the completely wrong line of work.
Exactly. If the idea of waking up and doing your current job for 6 more decades makes you want to cry, then maybe the core problem isn't the total length of your life. It is how you are currently choosing to spend it.
But if you know you have 60 more healthy years, you actually have time to start completely over. You have time to become a true master at something new. You have time to build something that actually lasts.
It completely changes your entire time horizon. If you think you only have 40 years left, you might just coast. You take the safe route. If you have 80 highly productive years left, you build. You take risks.
Exactly, you build. And that is a massive perspective shift that I think we all desperately need, regardless of whether we eat a bagel or a steak for lunch today.
I completely agree. The mindset shift alone is incredibly valuable.
All right, that is our deep dive on the LCHF macroeconomic revolution. It is not a diet, but a true national survival strategy. We really hope this deep dive gave you some serious food for thought. And yes, that pun is absolutely intended.
As always.
Thanks so much for listening. Go take care of your engine today. We will see you on the next deep dive.
Stay healthy.